Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Amelia Sharma Takawangoa, and it's my privilege to welcome you here today for a webinar co-hosted with the Aotearoa Circle on value creation for sustainable business. I'll do a short intro, followed by Vicky, Chief Executive of the Aotearoa Circle, then our guest, Mark Goff, then two of the Aotearoa Circle's partners, Annabelle Davies from Pāmu and Alec Tang from KPMG. So I'll start with a karakia. Kia mau ki te pito mata o te wā. Puritia kia u, puritia kia ita. Whānau whānau, hara mai tō teko. Haumie, huie, taikie. So my role today is to introduce Mark and give you a little bit of context about why the XRB is interested in the work of the Capitals Coalition. So first, Mark Goff is the CEO and founder of the Capitals Coalition, which is a global collaboration of businesses, governments, and civil society that is transforming the way that decisions are made by including value provided by nature and people. Previously, Mark led the Natural Capital Coalition and was on the board of the Social and Human Capital Coalition. He championed and delivered the bringing together of these two communities, creating a unified, systemic, and collaborative approach. Mark has worked extensively in the private sector, leading programs and strategy for the Crown Estate in the UK and Reed Elsevier, as well as advising many more. Among other board and advisory positions, Mark is on the steering committee for the Global Commons Alliance, the Impact Management Platform, and the Nature Positive Initiative. Mark was also one of the founders of Business for Nature, and as a key partner, Capitals Coalition currently sits on its leadership group. So this idea of incorporating natural, human, and social capitals, as well as financial capital, into decision-making is of great interest to us here at the XRB for several reasons. First, it's because decision-making is at the heart of what we do, with our standards aiming to improve the decision-making of all types of users, from investors for our financial reporting, to donors for our not-for-profit reporting, and to citizens for our public sector reporting. Second, it's that integrated reporting is also right at the heart of our purpose and vision as an organisation. And we really do think that we will all make better decisions when information is truly integrated. And third, and specifically to my part of the XRB, which is the sustainability reporting part, we now have a mandate to issue non-binding guidance on non-financial reporting. And so we're really actively interested in global trends in this space. Having Mark here is an exciting learning opportunity for us, and we are really pleased to share his insights with you all. And it's not often that we manage to convince someone to come all the way here to New Zealand rather than us traveling to other parts of the world. So thank you very much, Mark, and welcome. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please do put your questions into the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll really look forward to answering those. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Vicky.
Thanks, Amelia. Tēnā koutou, everybody. The Aotearoa Circle, as we know, is about enabling the restoration of natural capital. And we are interested in that for that greater vision of enduring wealth for New Zealand. And so we did a report, one of the ones that several ones we've done with Chapman Tripp, in April this year, and it was called Protecting New Zealand's Competitive Advantage. And that report gave a number, which was 80%. And last week, Chapman Tripp team updated me and said it's already 85%. So 85% of our exports by value are going to markets where ESG reporting is mandated, either proposed or enforced. So why are we doing this reporting? Our markets are demanding that. Our markets are our regulators in a lot of ways, and that is often ensuring that we have that market access. But the reporting is also just that initial starting point. It is our response, what information that reporting tells us, and our response to that information in terms of the strategic insights. It's what's so important. And those, the ESG reporting, of course, is what we're interested in, because understanding our risks, our dependencies, what climate is going to do to us, what environmental impacts is ultimately going to deliver what the Circle is here to do. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our Circle partners, to Annabelle and Alec, and hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much. And really have felt very welcome here in New Zealand. So I'm pleased I made the effort to come. I'm going to share a couple of slides and talk through a few things that are going on that I'm picking up around the world at the moment. So first of all, what do we really care about? So for me, I care about my family. I care about my children. I care about getting out and spending time in nature. And at the moment, the way that we account for these things is not included in the economic system. So the economic system gives us proxies, it gives us financial numbers, but it doesn't include the things that I really care about in those accounts. But there's a lot of people around the world that are doing something about this. We've been curating a global community for some years now, and this includes around 25,000 people in the global network, about 13,000 organizations, 19 country hubs, including one in Australia, which we'll be investing in quite heavily after the events last week in the Global Nature Positive Summit, and around 460 organizations at the core that are actively doing projects with us. So a very big global network that are looking to redefine what value means so that it includes these things that we really care about. Sorry, just trying to get my computer to work. There we go. So a little bit more history on the Capitals Coalition. Some of you may know about TEEB. So this was the Economics of the Environment and Biodiversity. This came out in 2008, and in 2012, we first formed as the TEEB for Business Coalition. That then transformed into the Natural Capital Coalition, which produced the Natural Capital Protocol, bringing together 40 different approaches to natural capital. And if anyone says to you, we need a framework for natural capital, there is one. If anyone tries to sell you their version of it, it's probably just a rehash of this internationally accepted framework called the Natural Capital Protocol. In 2018, the Social and Human Capital Coalition was formed, and then they also came out with their protocol as well, and I was on the board of that. What I realized quite quickly, though, was that actually, if you just look at natural capital, you're just as bad as if you were just looking at financial capital. If you just look at social, you're just as bad as if you're just looking at financial capital, etc. So in 2020, we brought them all together. I formed a new organization called the Capitals Coalition. From there, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures in 2022, that took the work of the Natural Capital Protocol and put that into a language for investors through the standards process of looking, and will be moving, we expect, into the International Sustainability Standards Board. The TISFD was formed 2 weeks ago, formally launched, and this is the Task Force for Inequality, Social and Financial Disclosures, which is taking all of the work from the Social and Human Capital Protocol and once again putting it into the right context. So if you're looking at TNFD or TISFD, you're basically applying the capitals approach. And we've had lots of companies that have started applying those things say, well, I started with natural capital and therefore it makes complete sense for me now to do the TNFD. On top of that, we've just launched a beta framework for integrated decision making, and I will share you a little bit more information about that in a moment. So the capitals, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Jonathan Porritt, who I know has been over several times, he used to have 5. The Integrated Reporting Council had 6. There's now 4 that we tend to use around the world. So natural, social, human, and then produced, which brings together the manufactured, the intellectual capital, and also all those financial capitals as well. So the human-made goods and assets. So a capital is any asset that stores or provides value to people. The reason we use this idea of capital is to allow us to take really what matters to us. So the things that we care about, the things that come bottom up from country, from the land around us, from our family, from our friends, and get that to translate that, to build a bridge into the markets and to the capitalist system. If we can do this properly, which we are in the process of doing, then this isn't a revolution of the capitalist system, it's an update. It's a bit like your phone. When your phone needs to be updated, this is updating the present economic system. And there's lots of people out there, accountants and others, that have the skill set in order to be able to apply these capitals. It's the knowledge and bringing that through that we need to do to make sure that all of the capitals are taken into account. It is an interconnected system. There's lots of different organizations around there. Amelia mentioned Business for Nature, which I helped to found a few years ago. All of these organizations have similar but slightly different language. So we've been working with them to make sure there's some consistency in the way we talk about things. The blue piece of this infinity loop is business, which has to go through a process of assessing what its needs are, making commitments, then transformations and actions, then through to disclosure. That disclosure passes on to financial markets, where they assess the work, go through commitments, allocation, and then disclosure, which leads on to what governments do around their assessments, commitments, and then incentive change and rules. You can see, though, that there is a system here of individual organizations that come together. So this alphabet soup is actually rather complementary in the way that it connects up. This is just one of many different maps that we've drawn over the years, bringing together some organizations which you might recognize. As you can see, they are very complementary. So when you start looking at science-based targets, when we did a review of the organizations that were setting targets, over 2/3 of them had worked with us already on assessment. So they were ready to move on to start making targets and commitments. When you're talking to the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures at the moment, or the TCIFD, the work that they're doing is once again feeding out of those transformations. And this goes on through the benchmarking and performance, through PRI, through all of these other initiatives that you might recognize. But we find this a really useful way of trying to connect things up. And the most important thing here, I guess, is that there's all of these different institutions doing different parts of the system. But there's a common thread that links them all together, and that is value. By value, I don't mean money. I mean the relative importance and worth of something that can be expressed as money, but can also be expressed in quantitative or qualitative terms. So that value, if we can be consistent in what we mean by what matters to us, what the relative importance of something, and we take that through this loop, it connects it up, creating a positive feedback loop, meaning that policy should drive better business is funded by better finance, and you can see the way that all of this loop connects together. A couple of trends I just wanted to bring through. So I've been on a round the world trip at the moment, started at the UN General Assembly, where the Futures Summit was launched. So the Futures Summit is bringing together Antonio Guterres from the UN, bringing together a view of the future, very much connected to well-being accounting, which you're very familiar with here in New Zealand. And 70% of OECD countries are now applying some form of well-being framework. How embedded that is into the decisions, how connected up the loop is different in many different places, but it's great to see that there's some progress within that. The Futures Summit was really trying to bring together a lot of that thinking, asking the question about how do we bring in Indigenous rights? How do we make sure that the next generation's there? And also, how do we create financial reform? How do we change the financial systems to take account of all of these different values and not just the financial numbers? That kicked off the week. New York Climate Week was also extremely active. There was lots of work going on there, including the kicking off of the Business Commission for Tackling Inequality, which I'm a commissioner on. That was the first face-to-face meeting of that group, bringing together commissioners to look at how we can tackle inequality, and also other things around social as well. And we also launched our new beta framework for integrated decision-making, which I'll talk about in a moment. From there, we went on to Sydney. So in Sydney, I was leading the business track and the business plenary. You can see me pulling a rather funny face on the top of the screen up there. We also had the Nature Positive initiative, which announced some metrics. I was one of the founders back in 2019 of the Nature Positive idea. The idea that if we can halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, based on a 2020 baseline, and then aim for full recovery by 2050. So when we sat down in 2019, we asked, if 1.5 degrees is for climate, what do we need to do for nature? And Nature Positive was the language that we came out of that room with. That Nature Positive initiative has now launched metrics for a consultation. So please take a look at that. Really important we have a common way of being able to measure a nature positive approach. And one really important thing here is that we're starting to see some companies coming through saying they are nature positive. I think this is a mistake. What we should be looking at is how we can all contribute together to a nature positive future. Every company has positives and negatives in the way it works. So I don't think any company can claim to be completely nature positive. but what they can do is they can take action to contribute to a nature positive approach. I think the event in Sydney was really fascinating. I think there was lots of progress being made, a little bit disorganized maybe at the beginning and trying to set it up, but it delivered in the end. And I also helped to host meetings with statistical departments looking at national level accounting, where we have about 98 countries now looking at national level accounts on nature, which is really important to understand the stock of resources that we can depend upon. There was also lots of progress around some of the financial pieces, but most importantly for me, I guess, I met lots of different people at different activities and different things they were doing, and we will be investing quite a lot more in making sure that all of those can be connected, leading up to what we hope will be COP31, which will be held in Sydney. So the climate COP is potentially coming to Sydney in 2027, and maybe there's an opportunity there after the Global Nature Positive Summit to actually link up nature and climate and people a little bit more. Some other trends that I'm seeing, whereas reporting was a really key thing for most of the businesses and organizations around the world we were talking to a couple of years ago, I'm now hearing the word resilience and risk coming through more and more as a driving force. This doesn't mean that reporting isn't still important. It is, it's a driving factor, but really it's coming down to actually how do we drive those better decisions? And that resilience question about how do we really understand the physical risks that we face? How can we address those both around nature, climate, and people? And how can we bring those into the fore is something which is definitely driving future conversations. Other things that are happening that I'm picking up on, well, I think that actually there's a big push around economic change at the moment. The economy is changing. The economy will change. The question is how quickly and how many people will be hurt in it. And the reason I say that is we brought together 20 hard-nosed economists that would never come anywhere near anything with sustainability included in it. These are people that really drive the present system. And we asked them, is the system really addressing the things that you want it to? Is it addressing the things that you care about? And after a couple of days of workshopping this, they came back and said, no, it isn't. It needs an update. It needs to include the things that we care about nature and people. And now they want to try and find ways of doing it. Well, the work of the capitals, the work that all of you are doing is helping them to be able to do that. Business resilience. So I just wanted to run through very quickly just a couple of examples. One of the things that we kicked off recently with EU Horizon funding is bringing together a lot of the different initiatives that have been going on over the last 10 years and trying to make sense of all of them together to make it easier for businesses and others to access them. So natural capital, as I've already mentioned, but also the UN system of environmental economic accounts. So how does this work from a public policy way into a private sector way? Transforming business, finance, and government, as I mentioned, through the loop already, but also some of the other things around life cycle assessments. How do we bring those things together? And all of this underneath a nature positive lens. Thorico, I hope you're all familiar with this example, a brilliant example from this region, Tasmanian Forestry Company. They were one of the first to do, I think they were the first to do a TCFD and TNFD report. Rain Vanderberg was the CFO there at the time, and she's now helping us to convene some activities around this region. We've also, this was one of the first to have independent assurance from KPMG, so a bit of a plug there for one of our speakers coming on later. And then environmental profit and loss accounts, a balance sheet as well, bringing all of those things across all of the capitals. They've started working there. And this is a really good example of how they've been able to bring this work into a decision-making process. Natura & Co from Brazil, they've got a target for societal value at 1:4 ratio. The thing here is we need to really be able to break that down, but they've been looking across all of their capitals, again, including the produced capital in the middle there. And the really important thing here is I was with them in New York a couple of weeks ago, and they're now building this into daily decision-making processes. So this isn't just a reporting thing. This is actually coming down to the decisions they make day in, day out about option appraisals, about product placement, about marketing, about purchasing. They're really using this to help them to design the way that they run their business. Really good to see them taking them to that degree. Some of the other things, their pathway here, as you can see about the management and how that comes through with CapEx, OpEx decisions. appearing there. And then also some of their results. And one of the interesting things here is when they were doing their summary table of their integrated profit and loss account, which they run as a separate document, they identified that their lower level consultants don't earn enough income, and that was a negative impact on their business. So things like this, pulling out really active things that they can work upon and do something with, rather than just a number at the end of a balance sheet. Finally, I just wanted to bring in a new piece of work that we've launched. So as I mentioned, we united the natural, social and human capital coalitions back in 2020. Since then, we've been helping social scientists, economists, environmental economists, accountants, government officials, all to sit down, and businesses and finance, all to sit down, and Indigenous groups as well, to talk through how we might be able to set out a way to connect all of these issues together. At the moment, when we make a decision, externalities is a choice. We choose to exclude things from that decision-making process, such as nature and people. What we're doing here is, instead of taking one issue at a time, taking climate and then adding something else and adding something else, that just sounds like more and more work for me in my business background. So I don't want to add another thing and then add another thing and add another board position and add another framework. What we're trying to do is set out a way here to update the system so that all of those things can plug in and be interoperable. How can we have those trade-offs, those feedback loops, all integrated into one system? Because ultimately we know they are, but we don't have the operating system to do that. Well, this is providing a pathway towards that operating system. It's set out in 3 documents: the Beta Framework for Integrated Decision Making, 27 pages, easily accessible, so you can get into that, you can hand that to your senior management. We'll set out some of the ways that we need to think about this, 7 clear steps within that. The protocol goes into a lot more depth, takes the natural, social and human protocol, for those of you that are familiar with it, and actually starts looking at those trade-offs, looking at those feedback loops, going through those difficult questions of how do we actually bring this into decision-making. Not just the principles that the Integrated Reporting Council brought out for disclosures, but this is about how do you actually build this into your management. And then very importantly, the governance of valuation, which I'll touch on very briefly as well. So the framework has these 7 required steps, like I mentioned. Each of these is something you can quite easily go through. Not everyone will start at the beginning. You may be able to start at different spots in that process. Then there's the AAA process of assemble, assess and act that the Capitals Protocol follows. And then we have this governance evaluation. Really important. A few years ago, I managed to convince a lot of those people with valuation data at a dinner to give me all the data. I left the dinner that night thinking, this is brilliant. I woke up the next morning and realized I've got a lot of data, and that's all I've got. So what I realized then was that we need the governance frameworks around this to really build confidence in that information that we have. And therefore we set up the Value Commission, an independent body that we curate, that has come out with this value governance for valuation. So this governance for valuation does 4 things. First of all, attribution. We've worked on this for 5 or 6 years now, tested it with many different companies. So the equivalent of how you have scopes 1, 2, and 3 in climate, how do you have that across the other areas around sustainability? And this attribution talks about direct, indirect, and enabled different assets in the same way that you might think of scopes 1, 2, and 3, it allows you to do that for the sustainability work. The Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures and others will be, we're talking to them about incorporating this attribution going forward, and then that should make its way into the International Sustainability Standards Board. Then we have transparency. So within this, one of the biggest challenges we have is black boxes, lots of consultants telling us that they can help us and giving us the right information. But then how do we understand that when we see that as a user? Transparency takes those things and makes sure certain things are taken out to those users. That's great, but as a user, how do I have the confidence in that information that's been given to me? So that confidence comes from these principles, these confidence criteria that we've created that will allow me to say I have a greater deal of confidence or less confidence in certain parts of this process, which means I can then take it to my CFO, my investor, or others to be able to say, okay, this data here has confidence. So we stop asking the question, where's this information come from? Can I trust it? We start acting on the information instead. And then the real breakthrough this is the value notes. In the same way with financial numbers, when we see our financial numbers in a CapEx decision internally or OpEx, or we see our financial numbers in an external disclosure, we have notes afterwards to explain them in a consistent way. The IFRS sets them for external disclosures, which then nationally we then adjust to make sure they're relevant for national jurisdictions. We've written that structure for sustainability reporting, or for internal disclosures as well. So with this, that sets out a structure which will allow consistency. So it doesn't matter which framework you're using, it doesn't matter which method you've used, as long as you can explain it afterwards. Because if you can explain it, then I can start understanding and start seeing consistency in these results. This is really important to make the point here that actually this wasn't the Capitals Coalition coming up with this. This has come up from a commission, global commission of the great and the good, as all these commissions are, that have come up with this work that we've been curating to bring through to this place. We have the backing of the accountancy bodies. We're working with IOSCO and COSO and other bodies to make sure that this can become an internationally accepted framework for everyone. But just to be clear, this isn't something we've come up with. This has come up with from an international process. That is all underneath consultation. So please, 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 I know there's an awful lot of consultations out there. There's a lot of work that you need to feed into. But if you do have a chance to take a look at this, please do. We've extended the consultation already. We were only going to do 3 months, but we've now extended to 6 months because there's been so much interest in it. And also with some particular requirements around at the moment, we wanted to make sure there's enough time. But it is a beta framework. It can be applied today. And we will be launching version 1 of this in July next year to take it even further. And then we'll be spending the next few years embedding this, like I say, in the regulatory bodies around the world. If you do want to be part of this or find out any more, you can find a lot more information here on this QR code or through the organizations here. Please drop me a line. So that's all I was going to talk about today. Thank you, and I'll stop sharing.
Kia ora, Mark. Thank you so much. And just a reminder for everyone, put your questions in the Q&A if you've got particular things that you'd like to know about. We're really keen to have a good conversation as part of this webinar. So now I'm going to hand over to you, Annabelle, and we'll just get your slides up. There we go.
Thank you, Amelia. Kia ora koutou, ko Annabelle Davies-O. I am the Chief Sustainability and Risk Officer with PAMU, been with the organisation for about 2 years. And for those of you that are not familiar with us, it's probably worth just flicking to the next slide, Amelia, because I think what this shows you is that PAMU farms of New Zealand have quite a wide reach. We have all sorts of soils, all sorts of climate impacts happening. We have all sorts of different, even I'm sure most of you will know that cultural differences between the top of the north and the south of the south. So there's a lot going on here, even different regulators and councils. That's how I look at it from a sustainability lens, but so too do we have farming operations that range from sheep and beef, dairy, deer, milk and sheep and deer to horticulture and various other things. So that's a little bit about what we do. Who we are is we're a state-owned enterprise. So our shareholder, we have one shareholder, and that shareholder does charge us with being profitable, but also enabling and testing things for the wider sector in New Zealand is something that we can do because of our scale and because of our ability to trial and test things. So what I thought I'd just share with you today is how challenged we are by following some of the historical capitals framework. And one of the reasons for that is because we're a purpose-led organisation, as I'm sure all of you are. But when we look at our strategy, so if we flip down, please, Amelia, when we look at our strategy, you'll see that we're trying to bring in some notion of how we're focusing on our capitals in our strategy. But so embedded are these things that it's hard to differentiate between them, because I can tell you when we sit at the top table, we all have a role. I might have sustainability in my title, but the Chief of Farming, the Chief of People and Wellbeing, the Chief of Digital, all are key dependencies for me to deliver my work program. So that means that whatever, call it a department that you sit in, We've all got key dependencies on each other. We are completely intertwined and unable to separate our performance from each other. So we've we've embedded that kind of approach through we're trying to now, through all of our systems thinking. If we jump down one, Amelia, whilst we have kind of called out 6 areas here that we focus on, which does drop out of our strategy, those same six things, if we keep moving through those slides, you'll see that again, we start to set our targets, our milestones for success. But when we dig further, you'll see that as I also carry the risk hat for enterprise risk, we break down in each one of our areas, what is our tolerance to fall outside of these risks? And inevitably, our appetite, again, starts to show up. Well, we may have a little bit of tolerance here, but the dependency on delivering a particular work program will be on our digital. Or, if we're trying to manage waste streams, it will also affect people's health and safety and things on farm. So we can't get away from trying to think of it holistically. That's been a real challenge from a reporting perspective. And I kind of applaud our comms team who constantly have us saying, well, it doesn't really fit there, it fits here as well, and it fits there. So for a few years, they've been trying to make it clear that they kind of sit under one pillar or the other. I'd like to think we've kind of now given up on that. We're just telling our story, because the reality is that it is all so interconnected. So too is, my team are responsible partly for preparing a sustainability plan on a page, which is, if you jump down another one, I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, but there are key targets we report on each year. And each year they're updated and they change. And if I pick something like animal welfare or animal treatment, we all know that the use of any sort of treatments for animals, be it antibiotics, starts to become a human health issue as well. So it's just another example of why we can't unbundle these things. And our customers, so although we supply key processes, our end customers are asking for more and more transparency at a much more granular level. And it requires not just me and my team sitting in a corporate office delivering this stuff, but it requires the farmers on farm to, follow suit, record any use of antibiotics, for example, record their chemical usage so that we can give transparency literally to our end consumers. So that relies on really good digital data, relies on really good reporting that can come back up to our board for governance. So it's just a tiny example of, not being able to stay in one lane any longer. Thanks, Amelia. Another example is our farm environment plans, which at the moment we're focused on those bottom 3 quadrants. So our greenhouse gas emissions, how we're thinking about biodiversity and fresh water. But our vision is in future years, in the not too distant future, it'll be a really holistic plan that every farm has that will help its business planning and its capital investment. So it may be retiring land, it may be making multiple use of land, setting aside areas where we have marginal land for improved nature practices, regeneration, or focus on biodiversity. But that will also have multiple benefits into their One Health approach. So those are tiny sort of examples of what we're thinking about. On the last slide there, Amelia, I've sort of done a quick brain dump about how we're thinking about reporting. Increasingly, it's less lag reporting. We want to give our shareholders confidence that we are looking forward, we are building resilience into the future. We can't help but be interconnected with our capitals. That is in our KPIs, mine, my teams, the leadership team. really showing how we intend to build resilience, how we might set ourselves up for a biodiversity credit market in New Zealand. So the metrics that Mark talked about, I'm deeply interested in. Our responsiveness to stakeholder issues can't wait until the reporting period is complete. Our responsiveness to our stakeholder issues happens, pretty much live. The continual improvement, and this is where a lot of our capital investment goes actually, is in our internal tools, so that we do look at it from a systems approach, really. Our capital investment cases start to ask questions now. If we invest in this bit of asset or infrastructure or technology, what will it do for our greenhouse gas emissions? How might it impact our soils or water or biodiversity? Is that particular piece of technology compatible with what we already have, or is it going to cause us headaches? How might that help operational excellence on farm and even mental health for our farmers? Does it make their job easier? And how might it impact on animal welfare or biosecurity practices? So every one of our capital investment cases now goes through a matrix that doesn't actually spit out the answer, but it forces the conversation. So we start to think it might be negative on this, it might be positive on this, and we think about it on the realm, and we can have really good governance conversations about where we might land with it. And then look, the last point there is we very much look at the consumer as our regulator, and that is really driving our focus on building trust and reliability of data. It's giving us really good insights into what we are doing, and that's all really helpful. So none of that is necessarily driven by external reporting requirements. It is us driving, well, it's the need to continually improve, I guess. But I'm really delighted to hear what Mark's had to say and what they're intending to deliver, because it means we're a little bit on the right track, but it's by no means easy. Lining up these things, including in the enterprise risk management system, is a real challenge. So it's definitely not easy getting it embedded across all our business activities. And I'm thankful that we have a management team that's kind of open to that broader idea. And I was also delighted to hear, as a result of that summit in Sydney, that there's real alignment coming with not only governance and financial institutions, but also policy, all thinking about our responsibilities here. That's really all I had to say, but thank you very much.
Kia ora, Annabelle. Thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting to hear about all the work that you're doing. I think you must never have a dull moment at work. So I will hand over to Alec.
Cool. Kia ora koutou, tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa. Kia ora everybody. Kia ora Amelia, Mark, Annabelle, Vicky. Really interesting stuff. I'm going to share my slides. Hopefully this works. And all I wanted to do, because I really want to dive into the conversation and the questions, but I just wanted to share a few reflections, less on the reporting side and more when we were talking about this webinar, we talked about decision making. So I just wanted to share some insights or some reflections maybe about the use of a broader capitals frame from a decision making perspective. Before I do that, I think it's really useful and helpful to think about the why, particularly here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I know a number of these points have been raised already, but I always think it's important to start with that why. And undoubtedly, for us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's really important that we keep reiterating how nature-based our economy as a whole is. Now, we often think about the agri side of things, as Annabelle shared, there's fisheries, there's horticulture, but actually if we think about tourism, if we think about fibre raw materials, if we think about energy, a lot of our economy is driven by nature, is highly reliant on natural systems. The other side, which Vicky's referenced already, I need to update the slide, 85% of exports by value go into markets with mandatory disclosures enforced or proposed. We are at the end of a lengthy trade route with a myriad of both environmental, as we've heard about, but also geopolitical and social risks. So all of this, as Marcus highlighted, is all about resilience and how resilient we are to those changes. Something else one of my colleagues, Ian Proudfoot, talks about as well is that, regulators bark, but retailers bite. And so we're seeing that come through in terms of market expectations of the information that we have, but also the decisions that we're making. And the final thing that I really want to raise, is that our Māori context obviously frames the work that we do, and that cultural context, and it was interesting as I was putting this slide together, and I really want to reiterate that it requires us and enables us to take a much broader view of business than through a single capitals focus. However, and it's a really big however, we can't just take those global frameworks. We need to consider the relevance and respect for mātauranga and tikanga from that perspective. So a few key drivers and one cautionary point as we kind of flick through. And so into reflections before we kind of jump into questions, reflections for decision making. I guess number one for me is when we are using these capital frames, and Annabelle, your comment about using capitals doesn't give you the answer, but it enables a conversation, a better conversation. And for me, capitals allow that, or rooted in that comparative approach. But it's really important that we think about those options. And I'm sure many of you have been in those situations where you have a number of options, you probably have your preferred options, and you just kind of pick a couple of other options that lead you to the option that you wanted to get to in the end, in the first place. And it's really important that we don't do that, that we actually think really hard about what we're trying to test through those options, what are some of the foundational assumptions that underpin our decisions, and use this process to test those. And so not all options are created equally. We have to think really hard about putting them together. And that centrality of, or central to compelling comparisons that enable that conversation is that they are well considered, plausible alternatives that test those foundational assumptions. The second thing I just wanted to flag is around boundaries and time horizons. And clearly, when we think about any of these analyses, we do generally have to draw a boundary, but we have to be really conscious about where we draw those boundaries have a significant impact on the outcome. So really considering what we're including and excluding is actually a really critical kind of starting point, even before we get to the decision. And the other part of that is thinking about the outputs, benefits, impacts, the progression of that over time. So at what point in time are we making those assessments? Because ultimately they will change. The graph at the bottom just highlights that from an external context perspective, so that kind of dotted line, at the point where your decision is made versus where that decision is actioned, and then fundamentally when the effects of that decision materialize, that external context evolves over time and actually could be a myriad of different things. As we've seen through the disclosure regime, thinking about different scenarios, plausible futures, we have to consider how that evolves over time rather than just think about what it looks like here and now when we're making that decision. The third point I just wanted to raise is this concept of impacts and dependencies, and the fact that our focus, particularly when we thought about natural capital, nature, biodiversity, has largely historically been on impacts. We see that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, from a resource management perspective, where we think about effects. But it's really important. This is where the capitals framework really allows us to probe the dependent side of things. And that's one of the things that I really love about the TNFD is the fact that it overtly talks about impacts and dependencies. And that consideration of dependencies is critical to moving us from doing less bad, which is effectively, let's do the same thing with a little bit less impact or a little bit less carbon, to actually ensuring enduring value creation, which is where we have to think about dependency and the risk and resilience of that dependency based on climate impacts, overconsumption, whatever it is we want to do. And the final point I want to make, and I've got some examples of this, is this element of creating resonance. And so this is a snip from Mercury's report, and I did talk to the guys there before I shared this, and they're very happy to share. Lucy Drummond at Mercury we had a quick chat about it. And what I've just highlighted here is what they've used in terms of their materiality side, their IR capitals on the left of this graphic, and they've converted it into things that resonate for them. So from a social relationship, they talk about customer partnerships, natural and manufactured, they talk about stewardship, human, people, financial, commercial. I actually really enjoy, Mark, how the framework you painted has moved away from using even financial capital to think about produced capital. I think it's a great way of kind of moving us away from that finance focused way. So creating resonance is a really important part, because that's critical to to the decision-making component and who your decision makers are. And just a couple of examples before we kind of open up to question of how we have to do this, or how we can do this through visualizations, imagery, and so on. And it was great to see, Mark, some of the other examples you shared. This is an example that KPMG has got this true value approach. But what we see here is a water flow example, and the water flow is great because it gives you those economic, social, environmental, and societal values, and it looks at both positive and then the negative side of things. And you can see fairly simply the comparison. So the image on the left is chicken production using animal feed. The one on the right is versus using innovative feed. And you can see how the relative, so again, this goes back to the comparative point. You can see fairly quickly how those different impacts kind of start to play out over time. The one thing that I would say about this, and we see it before, is how this monetizes things. And monetization is important. We can maybe talk about that. But it, for me, skews things to a degree. And so another example, and I've always been a pet fan of like spider plots to some description, is something like this, that you can see those different dimensions, but you don't have to monetize, or you don't have to put it all into one metric, but you can still compare between them. And so you've got here the OECD's Regional Wellbeing Index, which I found recently, which is really fun. It kind of shows you various different dimensions, and you can start making decisions, because it goes back to the point that Annabelle made, that there will always be pros and cons, and it's not necessarily an answer, but it enables better decision making as it goes. And so this is one example that I thought I'd share. The A and the B is just a point for you guys to take away, is which of the towns and cities in Auckland, in New Zealand, is A and B compared to Auckland there. But I'll leave it there. I can answer that question later, but I thought it was an interesting thing to leave us on. And that's me, and we can open up to questions.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Alec. Awesome. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions, and I was explaining to Mark before that the value of New Zealand is that it's really small, and lots of people know everybody. So I'm going to explain, Mark, that the first question we've got is from Donna Purdue, who was actually the chief economist of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So I think that's some important context in answering Donna's excellent question, which is, Mark, you mentioned a group of 30 economists you brought together to test whether the outcomes we're getting are what we want, and they decided that an update was needed. Can you tell us more about this group, and how will they be different to other groups like New Economics Foundation, Institute for New Economic Thinking, OECD's new approaches to economic challenges? I think new is the key. We need a title with new in it.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. So Joe Swinton was one of the people that helped us to bring it together, who's involved in the work on new economy stuff. Michael Weatherhead also from WHEEL, so the Wellbeing Alliance. So several people. What we've decided, thinking more recently, is that all of those that are likely to listen to us have probably listened now. They're either already starting to try and apply capitals, they're going through the difficulties of trying to embed it in, they're working through it. So the 10% margin of people in the world that are likely to work with this, be that government, be that private sector, public sector, have probably picked up the idea, and they'll pick up the next idea, and they'll pick up the next idea, because that's what they do. It's the rest of the market that's difficult. And if we continue to play in these marginal areas of the people that will play with us, then we're not going to get very far. So, and this is also the thing, marginal. We talk about biodiversity credits, we talk about carbon credits, we talk about all of these B Corps we were talking about earlier. These are all brilliant ideas. They're never going to change the mainstream, though. And with $2.6 trillion worth of perverse subsidies going in at the moment, updated from 1.7 2 years ago, I mean, inflation, but other things driving that. These subsidies are really pushing us in the other direction. So we have to play with the people that have power in the system. One of my team calls them Power Rangers at the moment, which I think was a TV show from the 80s. But those people that hold power are the ones that we really need to engage with. So I'm very fortunate. Our chairman's runs Hoffman La Roche, and a very big company, and has connections into the very mainstream business world, and was able to pull together a very dedicated list of people that we've been trying to engage with that would never turn up to anything we talk about sustainability. They do not see our work as being in their remit. And for me, one of the things that I want to do with the Capitals Coalition in this next phase is to move away from supporting all of our network, because there's so many of you doing so many things now, and start being that bridge into the mainstream. So we will be bringing together the central bankers as the next one. We'll be doing that around January. So some of them, like Frank Elderson in Europe, are a little bit more advanced. A lot of them are not. So how can we do that? The Treasury offices and some of those others. So we're really looking at the mainstream. Hence, I got a new black suit, which I hope you like, because when I was sitting on stage recently, I realized everyone else is in black suits and I was wearing some colors. So I'm trying to dress the right way to be able to be one of those bridges from all the great things you're doing into the real world economy, which doesn't necessarily listen to the things that we're talking about here.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Well, it's looking very smart. The next question is
Thanks.
for you, Annabelle. Annabelle Davies, I should clear here. So what leading indicators or metrics in relation to sustainability do you use at Pāmu?
Okay, well, we have a ton of them. So we have them across all of those things I showed you on that sustainability plan in a page. We will have maybe, you know, up to half a dozen under each of those. But we also stick really closely to our processors who are closer to the end market. So they are asking, that they are informing us what it is that our consumer is looking for and what is likely to come down, you know, our way. So actually, you know, part of that is about us trying to attain premiums, to support them to attain premiums into the market. And some of it is just simply access to markets. So what can I tell you about that? Some of the emerging ones, particularly around animal welfare and, again, use of antibiotics. A lot of it is around that nature space. So we have signed up and committed to TNFD. We are very involved in setting our metrics, agreeing our baseline, understanding our current state, where our threatened species are, what can we do to shift the dial on that. We're deep into that work right now to, I guess, position ourselves well for the future. That's the idea. It's not easy, takes a lot of resources, and it's tough on the farm teams because their world is expanded measurably, and the expectation on them is expanding constantly. That's tough. Probably doesn't answer your question, but you're absolutely happy to take that offline and disclose the individual metrics if that's a help.
Thanks, Annabelle. I think that kind of leads on to an interesting question I've had bubbling away in the back of my mind. And, you know, Mark, you talked about the 10% of people who are listening and, you know, can do this stuff. And definitely, I think, you know, in my time working in this area, there's been a noticeable shift in capability and in people, you know, interested in understanding these concepts. And I'd be interested in, you know, any of the panelists' reflections on how you see New Zealand's capability in this area, particularly around integrating ideas from one to another. You know, what type of capacity and learning and skills and development do we need to work us through this transition? Because there are not a lot of people with decades-long experience. You know, there are a few, and we're really lucky to have some of them here at the XRB and in other places. But it's certainly a challenge.
So I jump in. I'll start. It's a great topic, and I love this topic about how do we drive that change. And your question about expertise is a really, really good one, Amelia, because I think you're right. We have many folk who've worked a long time in this area, probably a little bit frustrated, a little bit tired, and keeping that energy is difficult. But I guess the key challenge we have, and it's kind of almost Mark's point, is the point of translation. Right. So the message we need to be getting across is that this isn't a carbon or a nature or a discipline thing. This is a fundamental business resilience and sustainability part. This doesn't sit on the side. It's not a nice to have. It's actually, we've got a huge amount of disruption that we're facing into globally and locally, some of those kind of Aotearoa specific elements. And business just can't carry on doing what it's doing. Because it just won't, and we need to think much more broadly. But the challenge at hand, and funny enough, we had a session earlier, and we were looking at, you know, the classic World Economic Forum top risks graph, and you've got the 2-year view and the 10-year view, and the 10-year view is always greener at the top, and the 2-year view is always like economic stuff and whatnot. But that's the same view that's happened in the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years of WEF global risk, that we've always said the 10-year view is longer and the short-term view is shorter, and it's not changing. So we've got to recognize that those short-term risks will always be there and prevalent, but we've got to make the point that actually what we're doing is still an important thing, even with those short-term risks. It's not something you park off to the 10-year view. It's something you actually have to prepare for and be resilient to now. And it's that temporal dimension that is challenging, but it doesn't need, well, actually, I would argue that it requires people who have been thinking about that short-term view to come to the table and have that conversation, which is why actually bringing some of those other economists, Mark, into the room is such an important part of the concept to kind of build your understanding of what they're seeing, the world they're seeing, and how can we translate what we want to see into that world. If that makes sense. Sorry.
It's just one thing if I can add. Oh, sorry, Vicky, you wanted to come.
No, well, I was just going to answer or ask another question around the capability, because I think that's what's dragging us back, is that there is a lack of capability and true understanding, and that's not just at governance. There might be one or two at the table from a board perspective. There might be one or two in the CEO exec team. Often, the sustainability director is there, but the others are still sort of catching up, still trying to learn. And so, is it chicken or egg? Do you go for the governance so that you get those questions driven down to the CEO and to the exec board, or do you build awareness and capability in that exec team to really try and raise it and push it through the company, but up as well? Because something has got to change. I mean, none of us did this at university. Amelia or Alec, being the younger ones, might have come across that, but that just wasn't there. And so the influencers, the leaders at this point in time, before that next generation steps into those CEOs, we've got to really upskill them to make sure that those changes, they can drive that change.
If I can just build on that. So we've working with lots and lots of different partners, once again, consolidating it. We now have CPD training and various other things that we're working through. I think it's 50 business schools that we're making sure there's consistent information around the world to make sure it's feeding in, but also anyone can sign up to those courses. But once again, it's not our course. We're curating it from the best knowledge from around the world that we've been able to capture, and they're continually being updated. But I think the key thing for us in this next stage isn't just the training, because there's definitely a skills and knowledge gap. Although accountants have a lot of the skills, just not the knowledge. A lot of other people have the knowledge, but not the skills. So we've got to connect those bits as well. It's actually starting to get to the point where we need to empower. So it's not about educating people. It's about giving them the control and power within this to then start doing something with it. Because educating people is only one-sided. Empowerment of people allows them to do something with it. So we've really got to start thinking of the broader narrative, how we let control go, maybe from organizations like us. And I'd really like to close down the Capitals Coalition at some point, because we either succeed, or if we fail, then I should be fired as well. But we should be passing that power over to others. And that's a really important part of this. And when I say others, I don't just mean those that hold the power now. I mean people throughout the system, people that are really engaged with this.
I think that's a really interesting point, Mark. From my perspective, I was listening to this thinking, there's a mindset issue in here. Yes, we weren't all trained to think that way, but and that sits at governance level, it sits at exec level, it sits at all sorts of levels, but there's a mindset around what is value. And that's what I find hard to push against as well. How are we thinking about value? Our shareholders might be looking at it a different way. So it's not just, it's not just us on the internal operating side. It is how they think of value and what's required of us. That's also a mindset thing. It takes it takes a bit of bravery to invest in something that feels a little uncertain like that, as a sure bet. Some of us believe it's a sure bet, and others are not quite there yet. So I liked how Mark introduced that notion of value. I think we should talk about that more.
Well, that is a fantastic way to end the webinar. Thank you so much, all the panelists, for your insights. We are really grateful for your time, and a recording of this will be made available. So I'll close with a karakia. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa punamo te moana. He huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Araha atu, araha mai, tātou I a tātou katoa. Homie, hui, taikie.
Take care.
Amelia, thank you, Mark.
Thank you all.